This man is Carlos, and that morning, he was on his way to work when he was suddenly stopped by an eccentric man who was standing right in the middle of the road. Feeling annoyed by the man, Carlos immediately asked the stranger what his problem was, and to his surprise, the man answered that he had a lot of problems, and that was because of him. The man explained that he was supposed to have the day off, but he was working overtime specifically because of him. The man then gave him a tape cassette, and on it were 5 songs written. However, before Carlos could ask the man what the cassette was about, the man had vanished. Before long, Carlos arrived at his office, still confused, but he had to focus on his job as a famous lawyer. Ironically, the case he was currently handling was his very own divorce. Meanwhile, at their home, his wife, Elena, who was a music producer and an ex-member of a band, was busy separating their belongings. Although they had been together for a long time, their marriage had fallen apart because they fought constantly. Later that day, when Carlos returned home from his office, he immediately gave Elena the divorce papers so she could sign them.
Cláusula 3. La casa es tuya, tal cual como quedamos.
Then, as she was reading through the file, she became annoyed because she could hear Carlos loudly chewing on an ice cube, and she told him that she was fed up with his habits and questioned why he never changed after years of being married. Because of that small problem, they once again fell into an argument. After a while, Carlos went to another room to calm down and noticed that Elena had set aside some band posters for him to take. However, since he knew that she really liked the band, he told her that she should just take them or, instead, throw them away. Upon hearing that, Elena suddenly fell silent before inviting him to sit down for a heart-to-heart talk. She then admitted that she was still confused about why they were ending things just because of their frequent arguments, especially since they could choose to talk nicely instead. However, Carlos didn't seem to care and told her that there was no point in trying to make up, as he knew that they would eventually just fight again, so it was better to end it all and blame the Cupid for matching the two of them. Feeling hurt and annoyed by Carlos's words, Elena finally signed the divorce papers, but suddenly, a radio in the room turned on all by itself. Carlos then approached and took a cassette out of the radio to turn it off, but he was shocked that the song playing was one of the titles written on the cassette tape the stranger had given him earlier that morning. Suddenly, the radio turned on again, and they were both shocked when the strange man from the road appeared right in front of them.
Están esperando a alguien.
The man then introduced himself as the Cupid himself and explained that he had come because he was tired of always being blamed for people's relationship problems. He told them that they were the ones who had chosen to fall in love and that their connection was purely consensual, not his fault. However, since both Carlos and Elena seemed to regret their marriage so much, the Cupid offered to send them back to the very night they first met to persuade their past selves not to fall in love with each other. The Cupid then took them in a car and transported them through time and space to the past. While they were on their journey, the Cupid reminded them to focus on what was truly important before they finally arrived in the past. Soon, they landed right in the middle of a Valentine's night party at the house of Carlos's ex-girlfriend. However, before disappearing, the Cupid reminded them about the cassette tape he had given Carlos that morning. He explained that if their mission was successful, all the 5 song titles on the tape would be erased one by one, and once every song was gone, their future would officially be changed forever. As soon as the Cupid left, a girl suddenly crashed into Carlos, causing him to fall. Surprisingly, it turned out that the girl was the young version of Elena from the past, and upon seeing her, the Elena from the future immediately fainted. Soon, when Elena eventually woke up and saw her old bandmates standing nearby, she was completely shocked. On the other hand, her friends were very confused because she started mentioning all of their names, even though they didn't know who she was. So, to prevent their true identities from being revealed, Carlos stepped in and made up a lie, explaining that they were both successful music producers who were interested in signing the band, but they wanted to see their live performance first. Fortunately, they believed him. Once they were inside the party, Carlos was distracted when he spotted his younger self chatting with his old friend, Chickless. Not long after that, his girlfriend from the past, Christina, showed up at the scene. She was the daughter of a very wealthy man, and although they were dating, it was clear that young Carlos didn't actually like her, and he was only with her because she had forced the relationship. She then approached to tell young Carlos that they had to attend her grandmother's birthday party the following night so she could introduce him to her family. She even insisted that he wear a formal suit for the occasion. However, young Carlos refused because he had already purchased 2 tickets for a band concert and wanted them to attend the concert. Unfortunately, Christina refused to go to the concert and threatened to break up with him if he didn't show up for the birthday party instead. After Christina stormed off, young Carlos felt a sense of relief at the thought of finally being able to break up with her. But the future Carlos immediately stepped in to intervene and began to praise Christina, telling his younger self not to waste someone so beautiful and wealthy like her, although his plan was nothing more than to keep his younger self from dating Elena. He insisted that Christina was the perfect girl, hoping this would keep his younger self from breaking up with his girlfriend and away from young Elena. A moment later, the party finally started, and it was time for Elena's band to perform. Then, both Elena and her younger self appeared on stage and began to perform. While they performed, young Elena and young Carlos locked eyes and felt like they were connected to each other. The future Elena quickly noticed that, so to stop them from falling in love, she tried to interfere with the performance, but that instead caused her younger self accidentally hit the sound system and burn her hand. As young Elena went backstage to calm down, young Carlos followed her and quickly helped her treat her injury. Then, while he was helping her, a concert ticket fell out of his pocket. Upon seeing that, young Elena was shocked and excited because that was her favorite band, and she had been unable to find a ticket for herself. They then began to get to know each other and grew close very quickly. Before long, before they parted ways, young Carlos secretly slipped one of his tickets into her pocket. Meanwhile, watching this intimacy from a distance, their older self felt defeated. They realized that if things continued this way, the two would definitely fall in love all over again, and this made their trip to the past useless. Because of that, they decided that no matter what happened, they had to make sure the two did not meet at the concert the following night. At that moment, Elena suddenly remembered something from her past and led Carlos to the old van her band used to use. Once they were inside, she immediately reached in and pulled out a gun. Upon seeing that, Carlos was completely shocked and asked why a group of musicians would be carrying a weapon. Elena explained that because they used to play shows from late at night until dawn, they kept it in their van just in case they ran into trouble. Elena then explained that her plan was to use the gun to threaten the younger version of Carlos so that he would give up his concert tickets so he would not be able to go there. Carlos agreed, so they decided to do the plan. However, before heading out, they checked the cassette tape again and saw that 3 song titles had already been erased, meaning they were on track to finish their mission. And since there were only 2 left, they felt encouraged that their future was almost changed. The next afternoon, they tracked down young Carlos while he was eating at a restaurant with Chickless, and without wasting any time, Elena approached them. She then pointed the gun at them and demanded their concert tickets. Both young men were stunned as they initially assumed that they were being robbed for money and were confused when she only wanted their concert tickets. Chickless then offered Elena cash instead, but she refused and insisted on the tickets. Then, as young Carlos was about to hand them over, Chickless suddenly tried to fight back, causing a commotion in the restaurant. Seeing the chaos, future Carlos finally intervened. He came clean to his younger self by saying that he was actually the younger man's future self. However, young Carlos didn't believe him and tried to run away, but Elena immediately pointed the gun at him to make him stay. Carlos then begged his younger self to give his concert ticket, but young Carlos begged him to let him keep his ticket because the concert was the most important thing in the world to him, as he was going to meet a woman he truly loved. He spoke about how he felt their souls were connected and how he wanted to make her happy for the rest of his life. Those romantic words made Elena's heart ache with sadness, so she leaned in and whispered something to young Carlos that only the 2 of them could possibly know. Upon hearing that, young Carlos was frozen in shock and asked how she could know such a thing. She then answered that she knew because she was that very soulmate he meant. She then revealed the truth that she was Elena from the future. She then warned him that while his words were sweet now, they would eventually only lead to heartbreak and pain after their marriage, so if he really loved her, he should let her go so she could find real happiness with someone else instead. Upon hearing that, young Carlos finally agreed and handed over his ticket. Then, before they left, future Carlos asked his younger self for his car keys and promised to return them later. Later, while they were driving, Carlos asked what Elena had whispered that finally convinced his younger self to hand over his ticket. Upon hearing that question, Elena laughed and replied that it was a secret between the two of them. On the other hand, seeing her laugh so sweetly made Carlos smile. He realized that it had been a very long time since he had seen her look that happy, and that reminded him of the days when they were still dating. Since they thought that their mission was a success, they prepared to say their goodbyes. But then, the street around them began to blur, and as the world around them changed, they suddenly gained new memory between them.
We fell apart, broken-hearted. Days felt cold and uncharted. We stopped laughing.
When the situation finally returned to normal, they were both horrified to see what had become of their lives. Elena now looked like a rock singer covered in tattoos. In this new timeline, she remembered having a terrible boyfriend who had led her down a dark path and become an alcoholic. Meanwhile, Carlos looked like an incredibly wealthy man with perfectly slicked back hair as he was now married to Cristina. But because her family was so powerful and demanded perfection, he lived under constant stress and had secretly become a heavy smoker. Their fate had indeed changed, but their lives had only gotten worse. In that moment, Carlos finally realized that his original life with Elena, the one he had never been grateful for, was actually the best life he could have had. So he tried to apologize to her, but Elena was still in a state of shock and immediately ran away from him.
Elena.
While walking the streets, Elena spotted her younger self getting into a taxi to head toward the concert venue. This is when she realized that even though they had successfully changed the future, they were still physically stuck in the past. Because of that, she decided to infiltrate her younger self's apartment to find information, where she found a cassette tape with a song list, exactly like the one the Cupid had given Carlos. At that moment, Elena suddenly remembered that those were the songs she used to play all the time when she first fell in love with her husband. As she looked at the list, the old feelings of love rushed back into her heart, and she realized how much she missed him. Then, when she checked the magical cassette, only one song title remained, and so she began to cry because she no longer wanted the future to change and wanted to stay with Carlos. Desperate to fix things, Elena then rushed toward the concert venue. Meanwhile, Carlos was at a payphone, calling his mother and pretending to be a police officer who had found his younger self's car so he could return it. At first, the call with his mother sounded like a professional police report, but as it continued, it turned into a deeply heartfelt conversation. While pretending to be an officer, he began to speak openly about his own life problems. He confessed to his mother his deep regret over deciding to separate from his wife, while describing her as the most beautiful love that had ever entered his life. He admitted that this beauty had been destroyed simply because of his own ego. After listening to him, his mother told him that if he was finally aware of his mistake, he should stop calling and start chasing his wife again. She also warned him that if he stayed silent now, it meant that he was still letting his ego win. Those words hit Carlos like a slap, and he finally realized she was right. Because of that, to make amends for his mistake, he immediately rushed to find his friend, Chickless, to beg for help. When he arrived at his house, he explained everything about the future and his journey through time. Fortunately, although Chickless was skeptical at first, he finally believed the story once Carlos revealed a secret that only the two of them would know. Carlos begged him to help him get his younger self to the concert venue so he could meet the young Elena and fall in love as they were meant to. Inspired by the situation, Chickless felt like he was being a hero who would fix his best friend's future, so he acted quickly. He explained that young Carlos was currently at Cristina's house and immediately took Carlos there.
Hugo Sánchez no juega el partido definitivo. Roberto Baggio.
Meanwhile, young Carlos was suffering through a dinner with Cristina's wealthy family. He was so incredibly nervous around them that he reflexively began to chew on ice cubes. However, because he was embarrassed, he reflexively spat the ice back into his glass, and that only caused even more embarrassment to himself. Fortunately, just as things reached their most awkward point, the future Carlos and Chickless arrived. Future Carlos then asked Chickless to sneak inside and hand over the concert ticket to his younger self. When Chickless entered the mansion, a dog saw him and began chasing him, causing some ruckus that drew the attention of everyone, including young Carlos and Cristina. But after a long struggle that left him slightly injured, Chickless eventually managed to hand over the ticket to young Carlos and urged him to chase his true love before it was too late.
La mejor elección.
¿Chicles?
¿Chicles?
¡Recupere tu boleto!
Vamos, todavía hay chance.
Mi ventana.
Tu boleto, Charlie. Soy la esperanza.
Touched by the sacrifice and the struggle of his friend, young Carlos decided he didn't care if Cristina threatened to break up with him. He immediately left the party and met his older self outside, while the injured friend stayed behind, joking that he needed an ambulance because his whole body was aching from the effort. Meanwhile, in front of the concert venue, future Elena felt defeated. She was terrified because she remembered that in this new timeline, if young Carlos didn't show up at the concert, her younger self would instead meet the man who would eventually lead her into a life of misery. However, just as her hope was fading, the young Carlos and future Carlos arrived. Then, before young Carlos headed inside, his older self stopped him and gave him one last piece of advice. He urged him never to waste his time with young Elena and to make sure he kept her happy for the rest of her life. Upon hearing that, young Carlos promised to do exactly that. But as he reached for his pocket for the ticket to enter the show, he realized that his ticket was gone. Fortunately, future Elena appeared from behind them with the ticket that had fallen earlier. Later, as the young Elena and Carlos finally met at the concert and began the journey of falling in love, their older self stood outside and forgave one another for all the mistakes they had made. Then, because they had successfully repaired the timeline, they were suddenly transported back to their original future. When they arrived back in their own time, they were both confused and wondered if the whole experience had been a dream. However, when Elena looked down and saw a faint scar on her hand from the burn she had received during the band performance in the past, this proved to them that everything they had experienced was real. They were relieved and held each other tightly, knowing their marriage was worth saving. Meanwhile, back in the past, the ambulance finally arrived to help Chickless. Then, while the nurse was treating his wounds, he began to tell her the incredible story of how he had fought to save his friend's future. He explained that his injuries were a badge of honor from his struggle to protect true love. Upon hearing that, the nurse was deeply moved and amazed by his bravery, and as they talked, a new spark of romance began to grow between them.
We fell apart, broken-hearted. Days felt cold and uncharted. We stopped laughing, stopped creating, turned our love into waves.